Opinion Civilisational state, civilization state, or civilisational nation, which best describes India. Merely being a civilization does not guarantee a nation state's elevation to the level of a civilization state. All civilization states are nation states, but the converse is not true in recent years. Since 2014, to be more specific, terms like civilisational state or civilization state have gradually become part of public discourse across large sections of the Indian mainstream and social media. In July 2014, renowned Indologist Dr. Conrad Elst used the term civilization state in a blog post titled India as a Civilization State, arguing for the need to rethink the identity of the Indian Republic as a civilization state. In 2021, advocate and author J. Sai Deepak explored the concept of Indian civilization and the civilisational state at length in his book India That is Bharat Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution, Bloomsbury, 2021. Last week, while answering a question on the Lex Fridman podcast, Prime Minister Narendra Modi described India as a millennia-old civilization. This statement sparked an animated discussion on social media, where some people, including journalists, went on to assert that the Prime Minister had characterized India as a civilizational state. But did he really do so? To many of us, the term civilizational state, civilization state, represents a rather vague concept. Often, we tend to apply the term quite loosely in writing or in speech, sometimes merely to sound cool before an audience. Many Indians end up confounding it with the Sanskrit term Rashtra, and sometimes with the European term nation, clearly oblivious of either term's conceptual frameworks and historical underpinnings. Sometimes we are just unable to define the idea behind these technical terms in clear, coherent words, largely because our woolly thinking hasn't been refined through appropriate training in navigating, interpreting, or carrying out critical historico-philosophical ways of thinking. In this brief reflection, I shall explore the ideas embodied in terms like civilizational state, civilization state, and civilizational nation. Hopefully, this will help shed some of the baggage of confusion and conceptual problems that these terms have put on, due to their uncritical circulation in the popular discourses of our country for over a decade now. A nation is a people united by shared cultural practices and political aspirations, though not necessarily bound to a fixed geographical area at all times. For instance, monotheistic faith-based nations may have clearly defined objectives of political expansion or the reclamation of long-lost political power and sovereignty. Over time, it is natural for such a people to develop traditions and establish institutions, whether religious or theological, social and moral, political and administrative, legal, juridical, economic, industrial, educational, or artistic, aesthetic. At a fundamental level, all these institutions embody the peculiar cultural practices and the specific socio-political aspirations of that nation and enforce them whenever these practices and aspirations are at risk of being violated by elements internal or external. When these institutions collectively embodying and enforcing the shared cultural practices and political aspirations of the nation repent through an unbroken, continuous existence in time, and grow a kind of resilience through varied temporal and worldly experiences, they give rise to a civilization. For various aspects of a culture, the process of continuously existing and surviving through time using resilience acquired on the way can be named tradition or, sometimes, custom. A tradition custom is not a concept, but a practice. More often than not it is a process, albeit long drawn, and seldom a fossilized monolith. Traditions and customs tend to be worldly, practical, and more tangible, contrary to concepts which are intellectual and intangible. Traditions and customs act as a bulwark against the unavoidable challenges arising out of nature and the limitations inherent in man. Traditions and customs operate in the real world, and as a result, sometimes they have to make compromises and adjustments with the shifting realities of the world, just to ensure continuity in constant flux. Consequently, traditions and customs bear clear imprints of the world. They belong to this world, not the other world. They pertain to and influence life, not the afterlife, even when they invoke the heavens or the divine. A society, which originates and exists through the day-to-day associations people form via economic and social exchanges such as in business and marriage, is both defined and sustained by its traditions and customs. On the other hand, institutions, as described above, are products of one or more traditions, customs that have deepened their imprints on time and on the shared consciousness of a people. Therefore, we can define civilization as a nation's culture wrought in a historical tradition over long years, and ultimately manifested as a network of multiple institutions that help preserve, as well as pass on, the core tenets of the nation's culture. Tradition involves not only the preservation but also, and more importantly, the careful transmission of a nation's unique practices, beliefs, skills, knowledge, and the nation's distinct outlook, down the successive generations. In short, a nation's culture, thanks to long-standing traditions, crystallizes into a civilization. Borrowing Marx's analogy, one could therefore describe the national culture of a people as the base, and its civilization the superstructure, a large and intricately designed architectural unit, like a palace, made of interlocking traditions and institutions, and standing firm on solid foundations of culture, which includes, among other things, politics. On the Lex Fridman podcast, Prime Minister Modi stated that Indian culture had crystallized into a civilization over thousands of years, adding that this civilization has a unifying thread running through it, primarily consisting of religious institutions such as pilgrimages and socio-linguistic customs such as people's names. This assertion is a clear acknowledgement of historical India's civilizational character and has the additional virtue of being an accurate assessment. However, some journalists, including those from the English language media and many social media users, seized upon this statement, gave it a twist, and claimed that the Prime Minister had described India as a civilisational state on that occasion. Let us now dissect their claim. A civilisational state or civilization state is a polity, i.e., a form of government, a nation organized into a political entity which embraces, or, is founded upon the worldview and the values of a civilization. For example, England used to be a civilization state before it was superseded by the UK. Russia is a civilization state. So is the Vatican City. From Asia, Japan used to be a civilization state before it was defeated by the West in World War II. The Indian Republic, a polity formed in the year 1950 CE after India gained independence from the British Empire, is not a civilizational state, civilization state, at least not yet, because the foundational values of the Republic and the operational worldview of its officialdom share a very tenuous relationship with the historical and still surviving Indian civilization. As explained above, a civilization is essentially the culture of a nation crystallized into resilient, time-honored traditions and institutions. Simply put, a civilization represents a more mature stage in a nation's life. In a remarkable feat of institutional resilience and traditional endurance, the historical Indian civilization has retained many of its constituent institutions and traditions to this day, with numerous Indians including the diaspora fervently upholding them. Notably, some of these institutions and traditions are mentioned in texts dating back more than 3 millennia. However, these millennia-old institutions and traditions rarely have the opportunity to shape or revitalize the present-day Indian state, aside from their cursory inclusion in mottos, sarkari symbols, and occasional lofty quotations in official speeches and documents. The currents of thought and behavioral patterns officially acknowledged and endorsed by the modern Indian state often contradict the institutions and traditions that define the living Indian civilization. Therefore, it is incorrect to assume that present-day India is a civilizational state. It will become one only when it fully and uninhibitedly embraces the values and worldview of Indian civilization. Until then, admirers of Indian civilization in general and Indian citizens in particular must sincerely and consistently work to bridge the gap between the living civilization and the mechanical republic. Superficiality, sensationalism, and clickbait journalism will not help in this regard. But if present-day India is not a civilizational state, can it at least be called a civilizational nation? Most certainly, it can. Let us now examine the concept of a civilizational nation. I will begin by challenging the way I have previously defined a civilizational state or civilization state. One might argue that a nation can still be considered a civilizational state even if the state's formal institutions and instruments such as the judiciary, the army, or the constitution do not derive any intellectual, moral, or traditional sustenance from the nation's civilizational character and legacy. In such cases, they may contend, a state or polity governing a nation qualifies as a civilizational state simply because the nation's civilizational character and legacy serve as a unifying force, holding together its diverse elements and ensuring its continuous existence as a single political entity. Following this line of argument, they may assert that India is a civilizational state because Indians are able to sustain a state in the first place due to the thread of civilizational unity that cuts across linguistic and cultural differences within the Indian subcontinent, regardless of how disconnected the Indian state may be from the nation's civilizational character and legacy. According to this view, the Indian Republic is already a civilizational state because India's civilizational character legacy stops it from disintegrating or balkanizing, and thus ceasing to exist. My counter to this ingeniously argued projection of present-day India as a civilizational state is as follows. Such an approach to the concept of a civilizational state only adds ambiguity to the classification and understanding of different types of states. If this were a valid way of thinking, we would be compelled to regard Taiwan and present-day China, i.e., the People's Republic of China, or North and South Korea, as entirely separate civilizations merely by virtue of their present-day divided existence. The fact that these countries are now politically fragmented and often hostile to each other does not negate their shared civilizational legacy. There remains significant common civilizational ground between these now divided nations, and some of them actively embrace or at least claim to embrace this shared civilizational heritage. However, in essence, each of these countries functions as a distinct nation-state while simultaneously being part of the same civilization, which currently lacks a unified state. But the absence of a common civilizational state does not prevent these separated nations from acknowledging their shared civilizational identity. The same can be said of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, Germany and Austria, or Norway and Sweden. Each of these pairs of nation-states shares a common civilizational heritage, yet this shared legacy alone has not ensured their political unity as a single state or polity. Nonetheless, they continue to recognize their common civilizational roots. Due to this complexity, I believe that the category civilizational nation is conceptually very useful. It can be defined as a nation that acknowledges its civilizational character and legacy, and yet does not operationalize that vital aspect in constituting and running its polity or state. Neither does it object to being balkanized, and remain in that condition, by appealing to its civilisational heritage. All the countries named above presently behave in this way. And so does the Indian Republic. Therefore, the Indian Republic can definitely be described as a civilisational nation, but one that lacks a civilisational state. Merely being a civilization does not guarantee a nation-state's elevation to the level of a civilization state. All civilization states are nation states, but the converse is not true. In Friedman's show, Prime Minister Modi was wise enough to avoid making a false characterization about the Indian state. It is quite likely that he is aware of the conceptual distinction between a civilization and a civilisational state. After all, he is the one who actually runs the Indian state, and, therefore, is intimately familiar with its true character. The author is an educator, researcher, and social commentator discoursing to rekindle the Indic consciousness in a postmodern, neoliberal world. Views expressed in the above piece are personal and solely that of the author. They do not necessarily reflect News 18's views. Nan.